Hi, and welcome to this episode of Is Jesus in Genesis? We're going to be looking at Genesis 11, verse 10 through 26 today. If you haven't read that, go on ahead and pause this video, come right back. We'll be waiting on you. And welcome back. So today's lesson is on the genealogy of Shem all the way to Abraham. And I know genealogies are typically pretty boring, but this one is kind of interesting. If you want a memory verse, it's going to be this. This is Genesis 11, verses 14 through 17. Kind of long, but it says this. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. And after he became the father of Eber, Shelah lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. And after he became the father of Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and had other sons and daughters. And we'll get into why that's important here in just a little bit. But what we're doing right now is we're following the Tower of Babel story that just ended in the previous verse. Genesis 11 has this genealogy from Shem to a man named Terah and his family. And on the surface, I find this an interesting genealogy for two reasons. Just on a surface level, you look at the ages and you'll find that the lifespan of mankind is getting shorter and shorter. And if you do a little math, you'll realize that Noah was alive when all of these men were born. And that's quite fascinating. So just a little side note before we actually get into the lesson, look at how old these men lived to be. Shem lived to be 600, Araxphad 438, Shelah 433, Eber 464, and then we have a shift. Peleg lived 239 years, Reu 239 years, Serug lived 230 years, and then we have another shift. Nahor lived 148, Terah 205, and Abram lived 175 years. And I know that we haven't even arrived at Abraham in the text yet, but my point is this. The lifespan of people born after the flood grew systematically shorter every couple of generations. And we don't know why humans stopped living as long as they did before the flood. There are all kinds of theories out there ranging from a dome above the earth to radiation to genetic mutation. It's during this time frame that in these generations after the flood that we don't have to look any further than Babel to recall that their attitude, the attitude of mankind, was saying something like, hey, let's make a name for ourselves and let's not worry about what God has to say anymore. So consider the irony. I mean, within the lifetime of Noah, the world is again chosen to abandon God. Now, why would they want to do that? Maybe they just wanted to live life to its fullest right now. I mean, they seem to have had this little quote as their mantra: stop playing by God's rules and make your own rules. I mean, make your own rules. Even that's a thing going on today. And this group of people, what they really needed was a preacher to redirect them to God, right? And Noah was alive throughout all of those generations. So I'm just wondering if Noah tried to redirect them to God after the flood. We don't have any evidence that he did, but I mean, Noah was a preacher, correct? I mean, he was. 2 Peter 2:5 says that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. So he did evangelize. However long he did that is debated. Some say it's a contradiction in the Bible. One camp uses Genesis 6:3 to say that Noah preached for exactly 120 years before the flood. The other camp says, well, no, he preached for 100 years using Genesis 6:10 through Genesis 6:13 and Genesis 7:6. As their proof text. Specifically, their argument is that since Noah was 500 years old when he fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and after the birth of his sons, God told Noah that he was going to destroy the earth, then that means Noah, since it was 600 years old when the flood came, that he preached for 100 years. I personally, now, this is not a doctrinal thing. I reject both of those answers, honestly. Noah was a good, righteous, blameless man even before he began building the ark. So think about that. God did not randomly choose Noah. Instead, God made his selection because Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. That's Genesis 6:8. So combine that with the fact that Matthew 24, verses 36 through 39 says that men and women who died in the flood, quote, knew nothing about what would happen until the floodwaters came. So if they knew nothing about what was going to happen, I can only draw this conclusion. Noah's preaching and warnings to mankind didn't happen while he was building the ark. It happened before God even told him about the flood. Now, that's my opinion, but that would explain how Noah was walking with God before the Lord told him about the pending destruction that would come through the floodwaters, and he was called a preacher, yet people knew nothing about the impending judgment. So, what kind of a preacher would not tell you about judgment? Well, probably a lot of preachers today don't tell you about judgment. But anyway, let's get back on track to this genealogy. I want to focus on someone that most people just skim over in this genealogy. His name is Eber. Now, does that sound familiar? The name Eber, E-B-E-R. Probably not familiar to most of us. He is mentioned a few other times in Scripture, generally as the father of Peleg and Joktan. But he is important for two other reasons. Number one, Eber had the longest lifespan recorded in the Bible of anyone after the flood, 464 years. He outlived Abraham. Wow. And number two, in Genesis 14:13, Abram, who's eventually going to be called Abraham, was called Abram the Hebrew. Abram the Hebrew. That word Hebrew means this, according to Strong, an Eberite, or a descendant of Eber. Wow. Okay, so how did the Hebrew people get a name for themselves prior to Abraham? Well, apparently, Eber's offspring were quite prolific, and this genealogy gives us the starting point of the Hebrew people, something that would not have been lost on the original audience reading this text in their own language. In fact, when Genesis chapter 10, verse 20 and 21 finishes listing the family tree of Ham and says Shem also had children, it gives us this qualifier, quote, also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. So it actually says, here's Shem, and he is the father of Eber. This links Eber, the father of the Hebrews, directly to Shem. And it also dates approximately when these Hebrews, or the descendants of Eber, began to be recognized as a unique people. It was at the time of Babel. So that's interesting. I come to this conclusion for two reasons. First, the distinction of people groups was according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, and by their nations. That's Genesis chapter 10, verse 20. And it looks like the Lord had some order at Babel and handed out those languages according to family and didn't just randomly throw them out. So families were given a language and they moved away together instead of everybody having their own language and nobody being able to understand each other. Families were able to communicate. Second, I come to this conclusion because Eber, the father of the Hebrews, and most likely the Hebrew language, named his son Peleg because he was born at the time the earth was divided. That's Genesis chapter 10, verse 25. Now, wait a second. Someone might argue, right? Wait a second. Doesn't the earth dividing refer to the breaking apart of the continents? That is a theory. But I doubt it. Although it does make for an interesting theory. But the word used for earth in the earth divided from Genesis 10:25, that Hebrew word, is the exact same word translated as lands just 5 verses prior in Genesis 10:20. It was in the days of Peleg that people were separated and divided the lands among themselves according to their families and according to their languages. Does that make sense? Okay. Let me sum up what this genealogy does. It does a couple things. It highlights the lineage of Shem, to whom a promise was given that his brother would live in his tents. That's from Genesis 9:27. It also gives us a generation-by-generation breakdown of men, including Peleg, whose days marked a great division of mankind. That's Genesis 10:25. And, of course, Peleg's father, Eber, who was the father of the Hebrew people. And then it introduces us to Abram, who would eventually be given a promise that generations later, his future offspring would bless the world through its faithfulness to the Lord. Now, does that sound very familiar? It does, kinda. I can think of a similar story. 2,000 years ago, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's John 1, verse 14. That word dwelt in that verse actually means this: he tented with his people. He tented with his people. In Luke 12:51, we are told that someone came to the earth to cause division in mankind. In John 3:16, we're told that man was the Son of our Father in heaven. And now, generations later, we bless the world through our faithfulness to that Son. So who is the Word that tented with us? Who is the Son who caused the division? Who is the Lord that we are faithful to? That's Jesus. I thank you for listening all the way to the end. This one was a little bit of a tough text to get to Jesus in, honestly. And I hope you'll pardon my liberty with some of those things, stretching a little bit so that we can incorporate this study of Genesis in this Finding Jesus in Genesis endeavor. But the next couple of lessons you will find are going to rock your world with allusions to Jesus. And I thank you for sticking with me on this. Have a great day. Be blessed.